Hey, I'm Sloan Leo. Welcome to the Service Design Show, episode 217.
In our world of service design, we often talk about designing for or designing with users. But what about designing by the people who will actually be using the solutions? That's what we're exploring today with a fascinating guest who's pushing the boundaries of how we think about design. Hi, if you're new here, welcome to the Service Design Show, where we invite the brightest minds in our field and explore what's needed to design great services that resonate with people, push businesses forward, and honor our planet. Our guest today is Sloan Leo Cowan, a designer, facilitator, and someone who's not afraid to ask the tough questions. They lead Flux Studio, a design firm that's all about making a real difference in the world. Sloan Leo's work has been shaped by their experience with organizations like the New School and their deep involvement in community-based projects. In this episode, we'll explore their unique perspective on design, their passion for community, and the lessons they've learned along the way. And just maybe, we'll find out how their experience from back in the day as a competitive slam poet influences their design approach. So in today's conversation, you are going to learn about why our current approach to service design sometimes misses the mark, how querying design can lead to more human-centered solution, the importance of questioning who defines the problem we're solving, practical ways to involve communities in the design process, how to challenge binary thinking and create more inclusive services, why empathy alone isn't always enough in design. One part that really blew me away in our conversation was hearing about Sloan Leo's work with the New School. They managed to involve 14,000 people in shaping the university's future strategy, even during a time of strikes and budget crisis. It's a great example of how community engagement can work even at a large scale. So, without further ado, let's get into this thought-provoking conversation with Sloan Leo. I'll catch you at the end for my key takeaways. I'm your host, Mark Fontein, and you are listening to the Service Design Show. Sloan Leo, you've directed your career towards working with communities and organizations in the social sector. We are super curious if you could take us back to the moment that sort of ignited your passion to pursue a career in this direction.
So we had to go back actually to high school. I went to high school in Long Island, New York, and it was the late 90s. I was one of very few Black kids in my high school and one of maybe the only out gay kids at that time. So I'm 13. I'm feeling really left out, really struggling socially, and feeling just really bullied. I came across a book in the library called Homegirls, a Black feminist anthology. It's a book written and compiled by a Black feminist scholar named Barbara Smith. And so I got very obsessed with this book, Mark. I was like reading it on the bus, reading it while I was walking to school, reading it in the library, and talking to my family about it, trying to talk to my friends about it. And fast forward 3 years, I'm in my freshman year of of college. I graduated from high school a bit early, and I'm in the public library. As you see, Mark, I spent a lot of time in the library. It's a big part of my story is reading, reading, reading. And I'm standing in line to check out my books, and like you can just picture 16-year-old me with a backpack on, and I'm holding this book cover, and I'm just looking at the back, kind of with love, and I'm looking at the photo of the author, and it's Barbara Smith right there, and I look up, and she is standing in front of me at the library.
Way. Wow.
I like totally fanboy, lose my mind, start like crying a little, and I'm just like, I love you so much. And Barbara actually got me really involved with our local community foundation. And that's really where things started. She got me involved with a local women's foundation called Holding Our Own. It's a queer feminist, community-based foundation in upstate New York. And that's how I got into doing work in the social sector. It's what shaped my sense of what community can be, for better, for worse, for harder, and for easier.
Okay, thanks. This is a very inspiring story. I feel that there is still a big gap between you being 16 and where you are today. Like, how did it evolve from the moment in the library?
I spent those years and pretty much every year since then trying to figure out how to make things better for, at the time, I would say for people who were like me. I started off my career as a policy analyst and as a fundraiser, really working to advance issues that mattered for queer people, for brown people, for people with disabilities. Over time, I went from kind of like identity specific work. I worked at the Estrella Lesbian Foundation for Justice. I worked at a runaway and homeless youth shelter for Black girls. I worked at a mental health organization. And then one day I said, this is great. And I think that identity based work is really important. But I realized that what I was fighting for and advocating for was for people to have a sense of belonging, access, and power and agency within the context of community. And once I understood that, it allowed me to shape my kind of following decisions a lot differently. So I started to ask questions like, how can I help like communities as the kind of core of the focus, not as the individual? So I shifted the scale of how I oriented the solutions I wanted to address. That brought me into the environmental sector. I ended up working for some of the largest environmental nonprofits in the world, including the Environmental Defense Fund and the Trust for Public Land, which are both $500 million nonprofits. So we're talking huge, right? And those were really great jobs at incredibly high performing nonprofits that worked with communities at scale. But I didn't feel like I was able to articulate my kind of precise theory of change in those environments. Because what I was trying to say was, we can do work better as a species if more of us have a hand in informing the services, the products, and the systems that we design. And that's what really took me out of the nonprofit sector and into an S Corp, where I'm able to run a studio that allows me to just do that. Make proof points that organizations and communities can do better work when they're focused on engaging community, however they define that, in the beginning, the middle, and the end of the process.
So, community plays a big role. Without stumbling over semantics, I'm really curious, how do you define community? What are the boundaries for you?
Yeah, it's a question I get asked a lot, Mark. People are always like, so I know you love community. Wow, wow, wow. But what is it? What is community? And so, depending on the context, I have one of two answers, Mark. The first answer is that I think of community not as a noun, but as a verb. I think of it as a set of actions or commitments that you take on a regular and consistent basis to create bonds and connections and to forge ahead. So I like this idea that community is an action, it's a practice, that we all can get in the better habit of. I like think of it that way often because it feels like a skill set that is required, not just like a place you arrive. On the other hand, Mark, I would say that community is a group of people who are committed to reweaving. And that definition comes from a book called Trans Care by Hill Malatino, where he says it is this like a group of people who are reweaving have a shared resource, a shared commitment, and a part of that commitment is towards one another to vie for connection. So there is something in here about shared resourcing, and then taking the actions to steward that resource and each other.
One of the things I was reading, one of the articles you shared with me, and I think in the first paragraph, it starts with the fact that you feel service design, the way it is practiced, approached at the moment, is there are some issues with that. I would love for you to tell us a bit more about why and how does that relate to the work that you're doing at the moment.
There's I'm going to cite another article, another paper, as I'll do a lot today. There's an author named Mary Camario who, in the late 70s, wrote a paper about community design and the commodification of community design. I think that her take on things has always been a bit of a foundation for my own critique, compassionate critique of service design, where she says that community design and this idea that design should be held by the people experiencing the product, the service, or the system. She says that that was what was happening in the 60s, and community design centers were a big thing all over the country, federally funded. But over time, as capitalism kind of got its strong hold on design as a framework, as human centered design flourished and grew, we get to this place where we now have a service design habits that are more informed by the pursuit of economies of scale and profit than necessarily by the experience of the people who will be using the service. Now, I will say that there are a lot of examples where the service user and the profit are aligned, and that's kind of like the dream goal for, I think, most businesses, and I understand that, right? If we look at a service like Airbnb, the better that their customers are happy, the more profit they're making, the more aligned the resources and the services are. Great, we love it. But my main qualms at this point with service design have a lot to do with this idea of political neutrality, which I don't think is possible. I think we live in an ecosystem of a politic, and not Democrat Republican politic, but values and kind of moral compass politic, and that we pretend in service design that there is no politic of decision making, and that people's how they want to use their resources is kind of like just neutral, and I don't think that's true. I would also, oh
Yeah,
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 sure,
can we dive into that for a second?
yeah, let's do it.
So yeah, I recognize that as well. That design or the designer tries to be objective and neutral, like you say, especially within service design. Maybe in other forms of design, less. But like, isn't that the designer? I don't like that word, but let's stick with it. The designer as the translator of the needs, the interpreter of the needs from um, people, users, communities into solutions. Like, um, wouldn't we want the translator, the interpreter, to be neutral? And if not, why not?
Yeah, I hear you. I don't think it's possible. I don't think that it's an unworthy ambition, but I don't think it's possible. For example, if I'm the designer of a service for a nonprofit, let's say that we do job training for a group of people, and that's the service we provide is all these skills and internships and the systems for their placement, et cetera, and the curriculum. I'm coming in with some sense of bias. Like we should assume all systems are biased. And that what we need to be doing is working to get that bias out, which requires having a perspective that the bias exists. And so that is not a politically neutral or a kind of a neutral attitude, is that I have a bias, what will I do about it? And so I think there's an opportunity there. I would also say, Mark, that part of what makes my work as a designer, I think, compelling and durable is the sense of connection and, in a certain way, professional intimacy that I have. And I'm not neutral. You know, I work with a project called the Brooklyn Economic Justice Project. I've been designing solutions to essentially accelerate community based examples of collective liberation and economic practices in Brooklyn, like community giving circles. And I'm not neutral. I'm like a Black trans person who owns a small business and was usually based in Brooklyn. So that connection creates a sense of security and psychological safety for participants. That makes the solutions we design more effective.
Yeah. So acknowledging that we have biases and being, instead of trying to, I don't know if hiding is the right word, but
The
uh,
press.
suppressing them, yeah, and chasing a state that's not going to be there anyway. You're saying it's much better to sort of acknowledge your biases and even enlarge them and make them into, bring them into your design process and leverage
Exactly.
them. Yeah,
Yeah.
and then we always have like bias is one way to look at it. The other one is an agenda. There's always an agenda, either from the organization that you're working for, or your personal agenda from the worldviews that you have, or the communities that you're working for. So, yeah,
I agree 100%. And I think that it's really shaped me to be perceived and to be seen as like a sincere, authentic, and accessible designer, which I'm really proud of.
this is one of the potential shortcomings in how we currently approach service design. The fact that we try to be neutral when it's impossible. Any other beefs that you have with how we're currently are approaching it?
Yeah, it's interesting. Mark, you use the word interpreter or translator, which I think is interesting. I tend to see designer not as expert translator, but as facilitator, which is not semantics and is quite a different position for designers to sit in. I was the designer in residence at the School of Visual Arts Design for Social Innovation program, and this year I'm doing something similar with MICA, the Maryland Institute College of Art. And a lot of what I'm teaching there is this idea that designers are facilitators. They're there to steward process and ideas. And so the difference is that instead of running a focus group with a group of users or stakeholders, as a translator, you'd be like asking a lot of questions to listen deeply, to then go back and look at your AI recording and pull out a set of insights and use those insights to inform your decisions, right? But what you do as a facilitator is that you're trying to get people to be in conversation with one another, be more vulnerable with you. And ultimately, when you're done, air quotes, with the conversation, you should reflect it back and ask for confirmation. Instead of doing the translating, you're actually engaging in a facilitated dynamic dialogue. And that is really different. So the feedback loops are different when you frame yourself as a facilitator rather than as this expert that's coming in to have some sort of like dictum or discrete.
Yeah, fair enough. I see that as well. Now I would love to know, like, how does this tie into the previous point we just addressed? If you're a facilitator and sort of focusing on the process and stewarding the process, how do you bring in your what do we say? Your politics, your stance,
Mhm.
your beliefs.
Yeah, there's a lot of practices in facilitation that actually stem and are rooted in movement work and organizing. So when you think about how social change happens, it's a lot of meetings and a lot of facilitation. So my kind of lineage of practice as a facilitator comes both from the Black church where I grew up, which isn't about religion, but is more about like how do we do community stewardship, and from organizing around war, peace, and power and agency for underserved and economically disadvantaged folks, or economically oppressed folks, to be specific. I think that there is, how do I say this? There's a way in which having a politic as a facilitator means that I know how to scan the room to see who's not taking up space in the same way and to invite them in more firmly. To have people who maybe speak a lot less. But it also is about like prioritizing which conversation you're having. Facilitation to me, Mark, isn't just the like what happens in the room when we're talking to each other. It's the decision of what's on the agenda. What's the modality for the conversation? What is the reflection back exercise? How do we evaluate what was good? What's the criteria for that? And all of those elements are informed by my politics.
That's interesting. I love where this is going because um, if we sort of set the agenda to us, we as the design community, the design professionals, uh, partially set the agenda. Aren't we taking away the power of the community to explore the topics that are relevant to them? Like, how do you see that dynamic?
Yeah, agenda setting takes up about 30 to 40% of my time. It's
Hmm.
a huge part of my design approach for how I do strategic gatherings. So, two examples. One, I was hired by the Chanel Foundation, and they said, hey, we fund 45 organizations doing feminist economic justice work around the country. We haven't brought them together since before the pandemic. Can you help us design a gathering that moves them strategically forward? I said, sure, I would love to do that. So in traditional service design, maybe I would look at a bunch of discovery materials. Maybe I would look at some of their past strategic plans and the reports from all these nonprofits and then come up with a proposal. And maybe I would get some feedback from a few select users, but mostly it'd be the foundation as the key, as the principal, as the client. That's not what I did, Mark. Burying the lead. What I did is that I actually had 45-minute conversations with 45 people. I think specifically I talked to 30 and then broke up the other 15 with my colleagues. But that allowed me to develop insights in advance of setting the agenda. Because that's the big difference in the community design approach to service design is that you're doing problem setting as a collective or agenda development as a group. So I was able to say, what were the trends in this conversation? Where were there areas of dissonance and of resonance and of alignment? And to pull from that a set of here's where I think we're reaching for together.
Let's recap. Okay, the taking a stance, not being neutral, doing being the facilitator of the process. Anything else that's on your mind where the current service design approach is falling short?
I would say that there is a lot of binary thinking in service design. We're going to go with A or B. We're going to go with this like one model or the other. And that resisting those binaries introduces more nuance. And that nuance ends up creating more durable services. When you can be
Can you give an
incredibly.
example?
Yeah, totally. So I think that one great example would be I was running strategic planning for the new school, a school of 14,000 people between students, staff, and faculty. And if you look at traditional strategic planning, you would typically move forward by saying, we're going to do some visioning sessions with this group of people about where they'd like to go. And so when we kind of came into some sessions to propose this visioning, people chafed and it wasn't the right time. They'd gone through the longest adjunct strike in history, and they were just like not in the mood or in the place to be visioning. They had critique. So instead of saying, well, we can either do visioning or not visioning, I said, why don't we critique the potential future as we see it coming? And we chose critique because it was rooted in frameworks that are popular and very often used in academia. So it felt original of sorts to this community. It was nuanced in that it allowed us to get feedback about what were the current challenges by engaging in a looking towards the future, saying if we continue the trends as they are, where would we land? So that like neither a critique explicitly just a critique or just a visioning meant that we found a more nuanced approach to gathering insight.
Where do we see this binary way of thinking in the design process more? What are some classic examples from your perspective?
Trying to choose some ones that I think are really solid right now.
So is it how we define our user group, or like
I would say it's how we define choices for the. I would say it's like when we just have like a determined end point that says we need to. Let's just say we're designing, I don't know, a system for checking out library books. Um, if you draw your user journey map and you've got your squares and it says like the user has a book or they don't have a book, is there a middle ground where like they have access to the podcast that was related to the book? Can we insert a path where they're not getting just the product, but they're getting like some sort of ancillary access to information? So creating something that's like, again, not a either or, but a both and, or something a little softer, a little squishier.
I feel that in the design process, part of our job is to make these decisions. Like, what we have, maybe that's the question here. Like, we have limited resources, and I think that's often the reason why people need to decide we are going to include X and not Y. Is that just an assumption that resources are the limiting factor to binary thinking, or can we adopt a more nuanced and plural form of thinking, even though resources are limited and we can't design everything for everyone at every moment?
Yeah, I think that the best resource or the best way I think about this is Leslie Ann Knoll's work on designing for the pluralverse talks a lot about this exact conundrum, Mark,
She was on
and
the show.
how. Oh, great,
Recommended. Yep.
wonderful, yeah, very big fan, big fan. And I think that what I distill a lot of her writing down to is this idea that we have to design within the real complexities of the world that we're in, and that binary thinking creates a reduction of detail, of complication that ends up with us, I don't know, kind of like making decisions that are less interesting and less adaptive. And so I would say that it's not that we have to just have A or B, but it's looking at the scenarios that would lead to that product or service and having perhaps a few more scenarios to understand if it's really going to pass muster, if this service is really going to work for more people or more systems or more moments.
I'll just keep repeating my question. Is there anything else? We we have three sort of struggles with service design at the moment. Is there anything else you feel we need to explore?
Well, this one I don't know where it fits, but I will say that I think it's somewhat related to the non-binary thinking is the way we develop personas often starts with gender in a lot of the organizations that I've kind of been near has been, we're designing for a man in his 50s who has two children and walks his dog a lot. And like, what are his needs? And I think there's room to do more work, not just around the gender component of that, but around surfacing motivations for people and using that as a core guiding force in their persona development, as opposed to using kind of like external phenotypical artificial identity markers. So I think that is another area that I would love to see some exploration or innovation. Um, and I think the other place I would say, Mark, is that the more service design focuses on service designers becoming even more expertise and rising to this like pinnacle of I am the best service designer ever, without thinking about how we're building the capacity of other people to be able to be in relationship to like talk about service design with designers. I think we create a real asymmetry in power between the designer and the user.
So
And
what do we need
yeah,
to do to make sure that the asymmetry doesn't get bigger?
doing things like making a like if you're going to have a focus group or a user conversation, doing some work to create some shared definitions so that they understand the terms that you're using is one simple way to create less asymmetry in the power dynamic.
And that would be for everybody who we are working with, like giving them, I don't know, how do you approach this?
Well, I'm doing a project right now with the Women Donors Network, which is a network of like 300 women philanthropists around the country. And their staff and their leadership came to me and said, hey, we have this design. It's somewhat loose on how we run our community, but we want it to be more intentional, more multiracial, more multi-generational. How do we design a more multiracial, multi-generational community model that our team can support, right? And to do that well, you could assume I would go in and be like, well, I'm a captain community design. I teach on this all the time. I know what I'm doing, and I'm going to do some research and make a model and propose it to you. Instead, I pitched to them this idea that we would actually train the people who touch member experience. So, like, they're designers, even though they don't use the term. Teach them what is community design? How do we define the process? What are the key words? So that when we began to do the pilots, which is what we're doing right about now, we're fluent enough that we can talk to each other in a way that they don't feel overwhelmed or confused, and they can be more precise in the things that they're observing or listening to or looking for. So the pilots are much more of a collaboration as opposed to a prescription.
And which role do you sort of try to? What is the capability that you first try to build?
Interestingly, in the nonprofit sector, the big hurdle is around, well, what is a designer? Like, what do you mean?
It's not
They seem
just in the nonprofit.
oh yeah,
That's a big
okay.
hurdle in a lot of places.
So I think getting on a shared page of like how to define design and how to see it as a competency that they already have, but a language that they may not,
Mm.
is the big first step.
And how does that work out for you? Do people, quote unquote, get it?
Yeah, definitely. People get very excited. Like, I know that when I first got into the world of design, someone said to me, "Oh, you're a experienced designer." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And I realized that as a fundraiser, which I was for, 10, 12 years, before I hosted a major gala, Mark, I would like envision myself walking into the room. What's on my right? What's on the table? What's happening with the lighting? And someone's like, "Yeah, that's experience design." And I was like, "I thought I was a nonprofit event manager, but when you say it, that does make more sense, or it makes the same kind of sense." So
Hmm.
the approach that I've taken helps people to see themselves differently, and then they feel much more not just bought in, but capable of co-design.
I wanna cycle back to what we said earlier, to what you said earlier in the conversation, that community design was working the way it was, again, quote unquote, intended in the 60s and 70s, and somehow we got derailed. Like, what's your take on how did we get from there to the situation to the mess that we're in right now?
So the paper I was talking about specifically articulates a timeline that looks a little bit like this. Communities at the time, let's just say in Harlem, were being approached by developers and people who had resources to air quotes invest in their neighborhoods and make them better in some way, shape, or form. And that those communities essentially over the course of time were saying, we don't need you to tell us what would make our community better. We know that, but we need the money and the resources to make those things come to fruition, to manifest them, right? So they had ideas, but not like all the agency and resources. Over time, and you can see this a lot in New York City, and you can look at some of the really amazing work of organizations like the Van Allen Institute, the Design Trust for Public Space, the Center for Urban Pedagogy. All those institutions are looking at this shift over 50 years from communities saying, we can do this if you give us what we need, to developers, to architects, all saying, oh, yeah, yeah, we did community engagement. We went out and we asked people what they thought of things. But that one moment of transactional engagement does not a community design process make. And so we've gone from it is kind of spread out amongst many people in the community, including developers or architects as part of that community or urban planners, to a model where they have said, this is mine to use to build the thing that I need to build. And that's, people are working against that at this point. Like the organizations I mentioned are really working in partnership with those people in the field to change that, but it's still the default right now.
What do you feel made this the default? Because it wasn't.
It's probably multifactorial, I would say, Mark. Some of it is the pace of development picking up in big cities. Some of it is the rapid, I think, way that the system of governance in cities across the country has essentially expedited it to make it easier for big money and people with those kind of big deep pockets to come in and do what they want.
Mm.
And so as that has happened, they've also wanted to like retain some sense of community like role. And I think that that's kind of became a slippery slope.
We haven't mentioned it, but the word control, and like, where does that fit into your vocabulary?
As far as community design is concerned.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
yeah, I can imagine the people with the deep pockets, they want to have a sense of control or to retain a certain level of control. Um, I don't know. Like, what do you
Yeah.
see?
I like to pull from as many real life examples and stories as I can. And I would say I was working for a while with a foundation that I have a lot of respect for. And they had invited me to come work with them with a cohort of people doing justice related projects, social justice projects. And they said, engage with them to figure out something they could do as a project. We don't have any more specifications than that. Eventually, they said, oh, yeah, well, we want to ask the question of like, essentially, I asked, what could they do together they couldn't do apart? Over the course of that first year of the project, it became clear that the group of people didn't feel clear on, well, what resources do we have to make something realized? And in a certain way, there was an element of control that was expressed because the foundation actually had money for them, but it didn't share it until later in the process. Whether or not that control was malicious is a different conversation. And so I think it's just important for me, at least for our conversation, to say that I think there are ways in which different stakeholders who have more power want to maintain that power and therefore exert some level of control to do that. And that sometimes that's a protection that makes some sense, and sometimes it's a protection that feels manipulative or bad.
One thing I'm really curious about in your approach is like, it seems that you want to and you are involving the community in the design process and moving power to them. To how far does how well does this scale? So when you're working with the group of 45 uh
Strategy
45
partners. Yeah.
exactly. Well, that's you in a long stretch you can still involve 45 people, but
Mhm.
like, what if it's 1,000? Like, what if it's 10,000? At which point Like, do you need a representation of the community, so a smaller
Hmm.
community in the community, and like, doesn't that lead to the same issues as in having a smaller group of professionals? Yeah, so I'm curious, like, how well does this
Yeah.
scale, and how do you approach scale?
When I first started the studio, my largest project was maybe with 15 people, right? It was working with a group of people doing design of a governance structure for a well known open source platform, and that does social oriented work. And I took a lot of the techniques I was using from that into my work with the new school, which again has a universe of 14,000 people. So the economy of scale was much larger and really tested the ability to grow these practices and to use them with a lot more people. Some of that was about changing how I thought about scaling, like what was to be scaled.
Mm-hmm.
So in the model where I was working with 15 people, I didn't have to scale lots of knowledge because I could be the centralized holder of the knowledge, to know what was the conversation we had last week. You didn't have to have a complicated system for keeping track of the notes and archiving every conversation. But by the time I was with the new school, the committee alone that I managed had 25 people. And then those people worked in 7 different schools, and each of the schools had 10 different directors. And each of those directors had 1,500 students, you know. And
Mm-hmm.
so the way we had to approach it was more of a train the trainer model, where I essentially taught facilitation skills to the committee to use in their universe and their part of the ecosystem. So I think that if we look at this as like an opportunity to scale capacities, to scale knowledge, and then to scale relationships by way of like maintaining some relational principles so that my sense of intimacy and connection with one person, they do that with 2 other people, those people do it with 2 other people. There's a cap though, Mark, is what I want to also say, is that I think we can scale a lot by being more open sourced about what we develop as interventions and as solutions. I also don't really want to live in a world where everything is built for millions of people by making it once. I'd rather just know how it was made, and then I can understand the core assumptions that went into it and make modifications for like my locality or my particular use.
So when you say more open sourced, uh, like, what do you see when you say that?
There's a really amazing co-designer named K.A. McKercher, who's the author of Beyond Sticky Notes. I'm sure heard
Will
of
be
them,
on the
or
show
am I?
soon. Yeah.
Great. K.A. is great. So in it must have been 2021 or so. K was part of or connected to a project that was like open sourcing co-design language frameworks, tools, and resources online. And that's the kind of thing where they have an amazing book, they have a curriculum around community co-design, but they also were contributing to a body of knowledge that other people could use and say, how would I need to change that considering I'm working in healthcare, I'm working in nonprofits, I'm working in veterans affairs. And I think that that understanding of making it easy for people to customize is scalable.
Where do you get your inspiration from with regards to this open source mindset? Like, are there good examples already out there?
I don't know a ton of exact models to replicate from, but I know that they are out there. I've heard about them anecdotally. My fun answer for you, Mark, is that a lot of this comes from my commitment to biomimetic thinking. So, biomimicry, as you know, is looking at nature for inspiration for how to solve or design interventions. And I got a lot of inspiration from the idea of fractals,
Hmm.
the idea that there's kind of these sacred or universal shapes that appear at all scales. And so I've always felt a bit of reliance on those types of thinkings to say, well, if we can make it small and shareable, then maybe we can make it larger and also shareable.
You've been doing this, you've been on a journey for 20 years. In the position where you are today, what do you feel is the biggest challenge for design professionals to adopt this? I don't want to say different way of working, but alternative, non default way of working. What are the biggest challenges for design professionals in particular?
It is exactly what we were just talking about, is the ease of demonstration projects, is like ability to articulate demonstrative examples that say, look, this is possible. So if we know that the community design process is a process that involves community at every step of the way, from problem setting to ideation to piloting to learning and evaluating, what we need are demonstration projects in every field that show here's how we do it and we know it works, along with enough data to say, here's where it doesn't work and what we do when it fails. We need more, what's the term again? Mulligans, like a chance to try again, and to show proof points and fail points and learnings. And there isn't a ton of that. I had mentioned the organization, the Van Allen Institute, because a big part of what they're doing is showcasing here's how it could work. And that I think is the biggest hurdle, is more people to try it on for size, so that we know there's even more examples of how this works at scale.
I can see what the benefit is for the communities. What's the benefit for us designers in adopting this way of working?
Ooh, that's a good question. I really love that question. Well, I have found that when I've talked to designers, particularly designers who are really early in their career, a few things stick out. One is the opportunity to align their values with their practice. And so for a lot of younger designers, it's about, for example, how can I align my commitment to ecological sustainability with my design practice? And can community design help me to do that and to think differently about those things? So I would say, yes, values alignment. The second thing for a lot of designers is actually there is, with constraints comes creativity. And I think that community can introduce a new type of constraint that can create a type of innovation that a lot of designers don't have the current access to, because it's just not how we're working. So if you're looking for a new way of finding creativity and sourcing new ideas, let a new constraint show up in the room. And then the third thing that I think designers can gain from this point of view or this perspective is um, um, a bit more agency. This is a non-linear way of working, and it allows for emergence. And in that space, you can be more curious and experience yourself in a way that is much more authentic and complex and dynamic.
Bring yourself to
Yeah,
the process instead of leaving
exactly.
your identity at the door when you put on your work coat, right?
You got it, Mark.
Yeah. Well, that is an issue. Um, One of the things you told me prior to we hit the record button is that you're sort of hoping to publish a book one day, um, and that's something that you wish you had done 10 years sooner. I'm very curious. What are some of the other things that you wish you maybe would have done, or you wish somebody would have told you like 10 years ago about the work you're doing right now?
I didn't think I was going to be running a consulting firm, at least not now. I had always assumed I'd run a consulting firm as like my retirement project, Mark. I was like, yeah, I'll work as like the executive director of some sort of advocacy organization for 15, 20 years, and then I'll retire into being a consultant, get a house upstate, and have a nice time. And because I lost my job in 2020, I was unexpectedly laid off. And it was like Feb 2020. I had been working in a way that meant, okay, well, I had this like project that was Flox Labs that turned into my business. So I would have loved to start the business sooner without it being because I needed to figure out like there was a survival instinct that kicked in to make sure I could make a living for myself that
Mm-hmm.
ended up also aligning with like the work I wanted to do as around design. But it
Lucky
would have been
break.
great to
Yeah.
think of that. Yeah, I would have like loved to do that sooner without that kind of pressure. Um, so I think someone could have.
What kept you back?
I didn't understand that essentially as a consultant, what you're like supposed to be great at is asking great questions. And that's how I've interpreted my career at this point, is that's what's been most valuable to people. And so I wish I would have known that sooner. I wish it wasn't the like, you have to know everything about everything to be a great consultant. You have to know enough to ask the next great question that reveals the best insight. That I would have loved to know sooner.
Also makes for a good skill to be a podcast host.
This is true, Mark. You're doing a great job.
Maybe I need to become a consultant one day. So okay, let's let's for a moment assume that we're excited by your story and we also want to involve our communities. Well, that's even not the right word. Involve our communities to make sure that our design process is community led. That's
Mhm.
probably a better word. Um, what are some good stepping stones? Where should we start?
Yeah. I mentioned earlier, Mark, this idea that designers are facilitators in the ideal scenario. And to that end, I would say if every designer in the service design world did only one thing this year, as in like 2025, it would be to read the book Holding Change. It is a small book, maybe it's 50, 60 pages. It's incredibly accessible. It uses storytelling to explore and understand how do you relate to facilitation? How can you embody it? What are some of the practices? It's very practical, but also very relatable. I think that would really have the power to transform user experience along with the experience of a designer.
What's the most important message you took out of the book?
Facilitation is an act of service that allows for emergence. And that frame of I am offering, again, is a gesture of offering, not of extracting, is a really different vibe.
Yeah, you're creating a space, a safe space, or a safer space
Yeah,
for people, for things to emerge, rather
exactly.
than forcing people or things through a process with predictable. I wanted to say predictable outcomes, but it's never predictable. To sort of going through a linear process, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so we've read the book. Is there one other thing you can suggest we do to get closer to this way of working?
Yeah, part of what I really love about my work and this work is that you're building on top of a legacy of some sort. And I think that you're building on top of something, but you're also reaching towards something. So when you're thinking about the engagement of community in a process or of a user in a process, don't just think about like, okay, they came to the focus group, they did the survey. Think about their engagement over a period of time. That way you're able to create connections between, well, you came to us and you gave input in this moment, but we're going to see you again in 3 months and present to you a version of this pilot. And then 3 months from then, you'll have the chance to say and celebrate with us when this new service rolls out.
One of the questions that I can imagine a lot of listeners have is, this sounds amazing. This sounds fantastic. I'm all in. Um, the challenge isn't going to be with me, it's going to be with the people who have the paycheck. So, like, like when there might be a lot of issues and struggles and challenges and resistance advocating for this type of work. It seems that you sort of found a certain group of customers, clients who actively approach and seek you out for this type of work. But I'm going to guess a lot of design professionals won't be in that position yet, right?
Yeah, change takes time, Mark. And so all
It's
of these,
ongoing. Change is
it's ongoing,
ongoing.
exactly. And what I believe to be true in my heart of hearts is that this type of change to become the norm is possible and is also necessary. When we look at the confluence of factors and challenges we're facing as a species, we need community design more than ever to get the durable, resilient outcomes that are necessary. I think the way that we need to change up in our business models and the way that we do pricing and the way that we do scoping all need to evolve for this to work effectively. I've done a lot of experiments with pricing and scope structures that have allowed me to do, I think, just fine and to pay the bills and keep a retirement account going and all of that. But I know, we're not a 100-person studio. We're just really different. So I think that what I would hope for are some people on the fringes, some early adopters who were down to use their practices as an example of, here's how we do a scope, knowing that there's going to be some room for emergence that may change our final deliverables, and a way to communicate about that with the client in a way that allows them to feel like they're being brought along, not like they're being surprised.
Yes, this will take time, and not everybody will be ready, and not every organization will be at the forefront. No, but again, it ties back to what you said earlier about all design is political. That the first question is, if you're listening to this conversation, does this align with my values and the things that I believe in and the things that I would like to see more in the world? Like, that's, I think, the first fundamental question you have to ask yourself. And if the answer is yes, then it's up to you to make the change happen, right?
Yeah,
And you can be advocating for it. You can start practicing it without actually telling anyone about it. But um, the first step is actually figuring out if this is also the way, the worldview you want to adopt.
I agree with that.
You're doing a lot of work. You've shared a lot of examples, which we love here on the show. If you had to pick out one project that you worked on, and it's always hard, I know, but what's the thing that you're most proud of so far?
I'm really, really proud of the work with the new school. You know, I mentioned them a couple times. They're one of the 24 clients that we've had over the last 4 years of a variety of scales. And I'd say about of those 24, eight of them were recurring for like 4 years and pretty significant contracts that were meaningful also. But the new school was so complicated and I loved it because it was so interesting. The dynamics at play were large in that you've had a board, like a shared desire to have a strategic plan, but also like five different definitions of what is a strategic plan.
Hmm.
You had the very significant and very publicly readable financial and budgetary challenges. You had a very unhappy workforce that had this massive adjunct strike. You had a change in leadership at the level of the university president. You had an interim. You had the war in Gaza. Like all of this happening at the same time, as the community was also saying, the last time we had a consultant, they made a lot of layoffs happen. So why would we trust this Flock Studio people? So you had all of this confluence of difficult,
It
complicated.
sounds like life.
Yeah, it was very. It was not very artificial. It was very real. And what emerged in that was this really beautiful, stoic, and committed group of people who said, "Let's rise to the occasion and figure out what do we want as a community to be true over the next several years." And I'm really proud of the committee that did the work and also proud of the over 1,400 people that were directly engaged in the process. I'm proud of the board for their own evolution. It was extraordinary. It was a really, I wish there was a movie on it, but maybe there'll be an article, you know?
Was there anything in the process that led to this outcome? Looking back, like, were you able to identify anything special, extraordinary that made this work? Was it maybe because it was so complex and so messy?
I'd say there were a few things for sure. Complexity is definitely in there somewhere. One was people's willingness to transverse their positionality to say, sometimes I'm here as a person who cares about my students, just as a human and the people. Sometimes people were there as the dean of a school or as the former faculty. So people wore a lot of different identity hats over the course of the project that I think gave them a different kind of perspective and just brought a real richness to how we had our conversations. People also put a lot of their own social capital on the line,
Hmm.
and that was unusual. It wasn't they were more generous with how they kind of went to bat for different elements of the planning process. um there was a real ability for this committee to navigate emergence and to reset again and again. So I think that ability to be agile was like unusually high. um and And I think that the compassionate critique model is still very unknown to most organizations because it kind of came up through this project. And can you imagine if every time you went to start a new initiative or a project or a strategy, there was a framework that invited everyone in to say, here's what I don't like, here's what doesn't work,
Mm,
just to get it all on the table and out of the system? What amazing data that would give you, in addition to doing some emotional like sloughing. So I think that that one is really great, and I would love to use that and have other people using it as a way to start projects.
thank you for sharing. And this is it's inspiring that these examples are there, and I do hope that they will make a movie out of this one day. But for us right now listening, if we are inspired by the work you do and want to support not just your mission but this mission, like are there any good resources that you direct us to?
Yeah, I would say go to New York and check out the Van Allen Institute in Gowanus. Um, I would say read Kay McCurcher's book Beyond Sticky Notes. I would say read a lot more books. Read Design Justice with Sasha Costanza Cook, and then I would start looking around, like do a little bit of a kind of scavenger hunt, a game of sorts, to identify where you're seeing community design in your life. Because you might not see it in your work yet. You might see it in your neighborhood. You might see it in how your kids are operating with their friends. So, like looking around to see where it is showing up in your world so that it can start to feel more familiar might be a nice first step.
And if we want to learn more about the work you specifically do, what's the best way to find out?
Yeah, stay in touch with me. I'm on LinkedIn. On Sloan Leo Cowan is my full name on LinkedIn. And then also you can go to my website, flockstudio.com, and sign up for our newsletter, What the Flocks, where I share tips and tricks and also case studies and examples of this work in process.
Nice. I'll make sure to add all the links in the show notes. And then there is one final thing that we recently started wrapping up our episodes with, and that is um, we love, as you said, as a consultant, you need to ask good questions. We love to think about better questions here on the show and focus more on that rather than finding the right answers. What's a question that you would like us to marinate on after this conversation?
I would ask you to think about, when was the last time someone made you feel like you belonged? How did they do it? And how did you extend that to somebody else? Or how could you?
Love the question. I will definitely marinate upon that. I usually go for a walk after these interviews to sort of process everything. That's definitely going to be on my mind. I really enjoyed our conversation. It was emergent. So I always have a quote unquote script or questions that I would love to explore together. But in this case, it was quite organic. So I want to thank you for that, for inviting me and creating the space to do that.
Thanks so much, Mark. I'm really glad we got a chance to talk today, and I look forward to hopefully being in touch and hearing more about what's going on in your show in the future.
And that almost concludes our conversation with Sloan Leo. Their passion for community-centered design is truly inspiring. I was particularly struck by their emphasis on questioning who defines the problem we're trying to solve. It's something I'll definitely be thinking about more in my own work. If you have enjoyed today's conversation, you can do me one big favor. Click the like button on this video and leave a short comment if you haven't done so already. Not to feed the algorithms, but to let me know whether or not we are on the right track by addressing topics like this. Finally, before we part ways, please take a moment to reflect and celebrate that by joining us today, you have directed your attention towards learning and growing as a professional. So from everyone who you are going to impact through your work, thank you for taking the time and making the commitment. My name is Mark Fontein, and I look forward to seeing you again in a new episode of the Service Design Show. Take care and see you soon.